Drew here, and I think that this show, Solos on Prime Video, I feel like it's the type of show that if you watch it, it would only really make sense in the context of the last year and of the social distancing that has been going on for many people, keeping people separated from each other in a way that we wouldn't normally experience. Because I think that David Wheel's intention as the creator is to kind of explore through stories that kind of have a sci-fi springboard, but I wouldn't describe them as sci-fi stories at all. More on that in a bit. But to explore through these stories that have a sci-fi springboard, the connection that human beings share with each other, even in our most isolated moments. And what this really ends up being, to a large extent, is a great actor, depending on which episode you have a different actor, in a room interacting either with a a human being that's not present or a non-human entity, and just sharing a monologue. And if that doesn't sound interesting to you, then I will say it didn't sound that interesting to me either, and it was a lot better than I expected. I think it's a real testament to the effort that went into this and the talent of the actors that this works to any degree. I can see that if you're the type of person who's into experimental art forms, and if you're interested in, you would go watch a play where it's just one person, then this will be a lot easier for you. If you're the type of person who isn't interested in one person shows and isn't really into experimental art forms, this probably is not going to be your cup of tea. The only thing that really makes it TV-like at all, as opposed to being a play, is the very, very, very dense production design. There's a lot of detail packed into every scene, and the musical score, which is very, very emotional, and it lends itself to some of the deeply moving moments that occur as the series goes on, and to some of the moments of tension that also occur during the 7 episodes. But for the most part, what you're here for is to watch actors act. And you can understand why actors of this caliber would be interested in this project, because it's a really, really good showcase for their talents. But heaven help you if you don't like any of these actors. If, for instance, you don't like Helen Mirren, then episode 3 is going to be nothing short of a complete and utter chore for you. And, I'll freely admit there's a couple actors here that I'm not overly fond of, but by and large, I recognize the talent of all the actors involved, and some of the ones that I wouldn't have described myself as being overly fond of actually surprised me. Now, if you're going to watch this, the stories do have connections, but they're mainly standalone stories, so you could, I feel, probably watch them in any order, and they would still make a large degree of sense. But I wouldn't recommend this because there are revelations and Easter eggs sprinkled throughout, and if you watch it in the order that they have them listed, I think that that will be more enjoyable for you. You'll see the connections between the stories, and the final story, chapter 7, which is the only one that isn't really just a monologue. I mean, some of the stories have, like I said, non-human entities or people on the phone, but for the most part, it's just one person in a room for the first 6 episodes. But the 7th episode, it's Morgan Freeman and Dan Stevens together, and it kind of gives context to the larger story. Now, this has been described a lot of places as a sci-fi series. It's really not. I don't want to overgeneralize, but I feel that sci-fi fans are more interested in technology and ideas than they are in emotions, and this series is pretty focused on emotions. I was reminded of an interview where Terry Gilliam talked about Schindler's List and how Steven Spielberg, he didn't like it because he didn't ask questions. He seemed more intent on giving answers, and simple answers at that. and that was why he didn't like Schindler's List. And this series, to a large extent, that is what it does. It gives very, very simple, and some might say trite, answers about the meaning of human existence and about the importance of connection. A lot of this stuff feels like it would fit right at home on a motivational poster or a Hallmark card. But to me, it was still very, very deeply moving in parts, and I still found myself pulled in to the story by the power of the writing and storytelling, really, I mean, literally storytelling, because the characters spin these tales that just give you a lot of insight into them and into their past. Now, 30 minutes an episode, more or less. Some of them are actually closer to 20 minutes. There's not a lot of time with these people. So on the one hand, it's pretty easy to sit through. It's very ambient television, I would describe it. I noticed right away that you could basically if you were watching it on a phone, you could basically put your phone in your pocket and you would not really miss much. You could watch this show or just listen to the show while you're doing household chores and you'd still get the gist of it, because you wouldn't get to see the actors' marvelous acting, but you would still get the gist of the story because it's all dialogue and there's not a lot going on screen. So in that regard, it's not a very cinematic series at all. It doesn't really take a ton of advantage of the 4K HDR format in which Amazon has offered it on its service. But, that's probably not a huge inhibitor to people that are interested in this. So I don't think that this is meant to be a big thing. I think that Amazon lately has done a lot of experimental series where they just give auteurs a blank canvas to paint on, and it's amazing the resources that they've put into stuff lately with seemingly little return on their investment. From what I can tell, it seems like not many people are tuning into the shows, but it was definitely an interesting experience. Now, I watched all 7 episodes before I reviewed this because I've lately had this problem where I'll review 1 or 2 episodes of a series and then realize that I didn't give it a fair review because it actually either turned around or hugely dipped in quality. So I've made an effort as much as possible, unless I think the 2 episodes are all I really want to watch and I'm just so done with it, to actually watch things all the way through. So based on the 7 episodes, I would rank them in the following order. To me, the most interesting episode was Jenny, which was directed by the show's creator, David Weil. And it stars Constance Wu, who is one of those actors here that I wouldn't have said I was overly fond of, but she really did a very, very good job in this episode. I think this episode played a little bit like a combination of Fleabag and the Black Mirror episode White Christmas. Now, that might be a spoiler if you've seen that episode, but I don't think it's a huge spoiler. But needless to say, the way this plays out, it was very, very obscene. There was a lot of shocking lines and a lot of shocking developments in the story that she told. But it was also something that it started out comedic and it gradually got darker and darker, and it, you just feel the pain of this character and their remorse and their sadness at what has transpired. So to me, Jenny was the strongest episode. I liked the orchestral cues that popped in and out throughout. This was the least sci-fi story in some ways until the very, very end. It didn't even feel like sci-fi until the last minute or two. But it was an interesting episode, and I think this was the best one from my perspective. The second best episode from my perspective was Sasha, also directed by David Weil and starring Uzo Aduba. And this one was interesting because it kind of tackled self-imposed lockdowns and showed like an excessive version of it. And it also tackled disinformation and not believing what you can see with your eyes to a certain extent, and just believing misinformation on the internet and allowing that to stoke your fears. So it was an interesting episode because it kind of handled 2 very, very different sides of the last year. And in one regard, it was very interesting because it was suspenseful, because you're watching to see this character Sasha, and this decision that she's trying to make as this this thing that's either AI or a human. We can't really, she doesn't know, and we don't know as an audience, trying to convince her to leave her very isolated home, and she hasn't left the home in 20 years. And what we don't know is whether or not the AI slash human that's trying to convince her to leave wants her best, is looking out for her best interests, or whether it's trying to get her killed. And there's a lot of suspense and tension throughout this episode because it's unclear what's at stake for the character, and we're not sure whether she should leave or not until the very end of the episode, when it becomes pretty clear what decision she should have made. So to me, this was the second most interesting one. The third, I would say, was Stuart, directed by Sam Taylor Johnson, which was the episode, it's the final episode, and a lot of the things I enjoyed about this one was that it was the culmination of the themes of the previous episodes. And Sam Taylor Johnson really does a great job at directing the monologues, both by Morgan Freeman in this episode and Helen Mirren in the episode Peg. I felt like these were the two most, like, oh my goodness, what an actor performances. And this episode, it actually brought me to tears in the final denouement. And I'm being very purposefully vague with these episodes because I don't want to spoil the revelations that eventually come out of them. I think it's better to encounter them as the writers of the show introduce them. And from that perspective, it's a little bit hard to talk about, but I thought that the way that this broke down, the interaction, again, this is the one that has Morgan Freeman and Dan Stevens, but it's really mainly focused on Morgan Freeman. I would argue Dan Stevens plays a similar role here, that the actors that weren't in the room that were, basically prompting the characters in previous episodes, he's basically playing that role. He gets a little bit more to do, but for the most part, it's a Morgan Freeman monologue. And he really pounds home a lot of points. It's very moving in that it, like I said, it's the culmination of the previous episodes, and it really draws out a lot about human connection. And as someone who is a parent who oftentimes feels as though I'm failing my children, I felt very moved by a lot of what Morgan Freeman's Stuart had to say here. Fourth best episode from my perspective was Leia, directed by Zach Braff. And this is the first episode, and it's honestly like the least suggestive of what the show is going to be like. So if you watch the first episode and are like, what is the rest of the show going to be like? Well, not really like the first episode. It's the one with Anne Hathaway, and this one, it's interesting because it's the one that it's the least of a monologue, because basically they come up with this conceit where Anne Hathaway's character, Leia, is having conversations with herself, and it's unclear whether she's talking to her past or future self at various points. And they get a lot of humor out of this episode. I was actually laughing out loud by the comic timing of a lot of it, and Anne Hathaway does a really good job convincing you that these are three separate, or well, it's the same individual at three different points in time, and making you see the differences between herself at these different junctures. But the final denouement in this episode, there were a lot of interesting twists along the way. One gave me chills, but the final denouement really didn't overly sell it to me. I felt like it came a little out of left field, and it just felt like, oh, we kind of have to wrap this up. But on the whole, I thought that this was one of the more interesting episodes as well. I just felt like it wasn't quite at the level of the other three. Now, this other episode, I thought the fifth best episode from my perspective was Peg, also directed by Sam Taylor Johnson, and this one was basically just a monologue. Like, it was Helen Mirren giving a monologue about how nobody sees her, about how she wants to be anonymous, but then also feels resentment when she has become invisible and nobody recognizes her. And it's interesting because Helen Mirren apparently was surprised to find out that the show's creator, David Weil, wrote this episode because he captured so much what it feels to be a woman and it feels to be invisible. And I definitely felt that he did a very, very good job getting inside the head of this character, Peg. And there's an interesting connection here to the episode with Anthony Mackie, Tom, but I can't really get into that without spoilers. But it was a surprising connection. And I wish that this episode or that episode had explored the darker aspects of their shared connection a little bit more. It's an interesting thing that they could have explored, but instead they dwelled on the more saccharine aspects of these characters' storylines. And there really wasn't a lot sci-fi here going on at all. She's traveling into the farthest reaches of space to try and find some meaning for herself, to kind of find, maybe there's something in me that is important. And it's kind of like Ad Astra in that it's like the ultimate message is, oh, you shouldn't travel off into space to try and find yourself. What you're looking for was at home the whole time. And again, I feel like Helen Mirren easily, her and Morgan Freeman just knock it out of the park in terms of delivering these monologues. They just hold your attention and never let go. And the only real interaction she has this episode is with this AI character that seems vaguely reminiscent of Hal from 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I couldn't figure out who was voicing the AI at first. It's Dan Stevens, apparently, who also, as I said, makes an appearance in episode 7. That's not a spoiler because I don't think it's intended to be the same character. But regardless, it's her show, and from the perspective of just getting to watch someone act and carry you through some emotions, it's pretty interesting, but it doesn't have the creativity of a lot of the other episodes. Sixth episode in order of my preference was Nira, directed by Tiffany Johnson, and it stars Nicole Beharie, probably the least recognizable actor in this batch of episodes. And to me, this one was just a little bit ambiguous and vague. I didn't think that it really managed to tell a complete story in the way that some of the others did. It had an interesting concept, and it really managed to create a lot of tension and dread around this character and her isolated situation and her fears about the way that the situation is developing. But on the whole, there wasn't a lot for me to remember here. It kind of felt like an episode to me that was there to fill out an episode count rather than a really, really intentionally made episode. Lastly, and this is my least favorite, and this is the second episode of the season, Tom, starring Anthony Mackie and directed again by David Weil. And to me, the problem with this episode is that they hold back on revealing what the concept is, although it becomes pretty obvious to me. It became pretty obvious to me pretty quickly when Anthony Mackie's character, Tom, coughed, which, someone very astutely pointed out in a review of this, is universal language for dying of cancer, probably. And he's having a conversation with his clone, and this clone seems to be trying to get to know him, and so that he can replicate him, so that he can act like him, so that he can capture who he is. And you can probably deduce from that what the setup for this episode is, but, again, I'm going to let you figure it out as you go along if you haven't figured it out already. But to me, the big problem with this one is it quickly devolved into a monologue from Anthony Mackie about the various members of his family and what he loves about each of them. And don't get me wrong, Anthony Mackie is a very, very talented actor, but to me, this just didn't play to his strengths. I think he's an actor that does better when he's moving. I think that there's some actors that are good at monologues and some actors that are better in more active roles. And I think Anthony Mackie is an actor who needs a more active role. And I felt like the differentiation in the acting between the clone and the original, the human character, just wasn't strong enough. I thought Anne Hathaway managed to differentiate the different timelines better than Anthony Mackie manages to differentiate himself from his clone in this scene. And like I said, I found myself tuning out a lot of it because he was just saying generic speeches about his family and what he loves about each of them. And this one, again, it kind of rammed home the schmaltz at the end, and it just didn't really have a unique enough concept from my perspective. So those are my rankings of the episodes. I'm sure mileage will vary. Some of you will probably think the exact opposite of what I thought, and that's okay. Let me know what you thought in the comments. I'm interested to hear. But on the whole, if you're looking for like a sci-fi series like Black Mirror, this is a lot more akin to another anthology series that Amazon has produced called Modern Love, which also incidentally features Anne Hathaway. So this is a lot more tonally and just otherwise similar to that. It's interesting to see the creativity of the writers and the brilliance of these actors, but in a lot of ways, I feel like, this isn't something that you have to watch unless you're really interested in experimental storytelling. I'm obsessed with different forms of storytelling and how writers and actors can convey things, in a minimalistic fashion, as is the case here. But at the same time, I'm like, well, I got the point after about 2 episodes. I don't know that I needed to watch the whole thing, except it was relatively easy to sit through. So those are my thoughts for what they are worth. Let me know what you thought in the comments. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of other shows and movies and occasionally books, please consider subscribing. And as always, thanks for watching.